"You don't belong here anymore." The words landed flat and cold, echoing just enough across the open office to make every keyboard pause for half a second too long, and then silence. Richard Collins didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His tone carried the kind of quiet authority that made people obey before thinking. He stood beside the glass wall of the operations floor, one hand holding a thin manila folder, the other adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy suit as if this moment were just another item on his schedule. Across from him stood Samuel Carter, shoulders slightly hunched but steady, a small cardboard box resting on the edge of his workbench. Inside it, a worn thermos, a neatly folded grey jacket, and a screwdriver set polished from years of careful use. 28 years in this building, and everything he owned here now fit into a box no bigger than a microwave. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a pale reflection on the polished concrete floor, and for a moment, no one moved. Not the interns pretending to read reports, not the supervisors glancing sideways, not even the janitorial cart parked quietly by the far wall. Samuel's hand hovered just above the box before he finally rested it there, fingers brushing the edge like he was confirming it was real. "Sir," he said, voice low, calm, measured like someone used to choosing his words carefully, "there's something you should know before I go." Richard didn't even look up from the folder. "What I should know," he replied, flipping it closed with a soft snap, "is that this company is moving forward. And we're not carrying outdated systems, or the people tied to them, with us." A faint ripple of discomfort passed through the room, subtle but undeniable, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. Samuel nodded once, slow, almost respectful, as if he had expected that answer. He didn't argue. Didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded access badge, the plastic edges worn smooth, the printed photo slightly washed with time. For a brief second, his thumb traced over his own name, Samuel Carter, before he placed it gently on the workbench. The sound was barely audible, a soft click against metal, but in the stillness, it carried. Richard exhaled, impatient now. "Security will escort you out," he added, already turning away as if the matter had been resolved. Samuel lifted the box, not heavy, not difficult, but he held it with both hands anyway, careful, deliberate. As he stepped away from the bench, his eyes moved, not across the people, not toward the exit, but briefly, almost instinctively, toward the far end of the room where a plain section of wall stood uninterrupted, just painted drywall like any other. He paused there for half a second. Just enough to notice. Just enough to remember. Then he kept walking. His footsteps were quiet against the concrete, steady, unhurried, each one echoing slightly under the high ceiling. Behind him, the office slowly exhaled back into motion, chairs creaked, screens flickered, someone cleared their throat, but no one spoke. At the glass doors, Samuel stopped again, shifting the box slightly in his arms as the late afternoon light filtered in, warm and golden, cutting across the sterile grey of the interior. Dust particles floated in that beam of light, slow and weightless, catching in the air like time itself had decided to linger. He adjusted his grip, straightened just a little, and reached for the handle. And somewhere deep in the building, almost too faint to notice, a system light flickered once, then again. The glass door clicked softly behind him as Samuel stepped into the corridor, the sound barely louder than a breath, yet it marked something final in a way words never could. The air outside the operations floor felt different, cooler, quieter, stripped of the constant hum of machines and muted conversations. Down the long hallway, the polished tiles reflected the overhead lights in clean, repeating lines, each step he took echoing just a fraction longer than it should. He did not rush. He had never rushed, not in 28 years, not even on the nights when alarms blinked red and the building held its breath waiting for something to fail. His grip on the box remained steady, but his fingers shifted slightly, adjusting around the edges as if they remembered the weight of tools more than the weight of leaving. Behind the walls, deep within the infrastructure no one ever saw, a faint pulse of energy flickered again, subtle and irregular, like a heartbeat trying to find its rhythm. In the operations room, a junior analyst frowned at his monitor, tapping a key twice, then a third time. The numbers on his screen hesitated, then refreshed slower than usual. He leaned forward, squinting, unsure whether it was a glitch or just the network lagging. Across the floor, someone else noticed a delay in a system response, then another. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it spread quietly, threading through departments like a whisper no one could quite hear. Richard Collins, already back in his glass office, loosened his tie slightly as he scanned a set of digital reports on his tablet. Everything looked clean on the surface. Transition schedules, system upgrades, restructuring timelines. Efficient. Controlled. Exactly how he preferred it. He did not notice the brief flicker of the overhead light above his desk, nor the half-second delay when he swiped to the next page. To him, the building was a system that could be replaced, upgraded, optimized. Components in, components out. No sentiment, no attachment. Just progress. Down the hallway, Samuel passed a row of framed photographs mounted along the wall, each one capturing a different year of the company's growth. Groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, groups of executives in tailored suits shaking hands beneath bright banners. He slowed for just a moment, his eyes settling on an older photo near the end of the row. The colors were slightly faded, the edges worn, but the image remained clear enough. A much younger version of the building stood behind a small group of people, simpler, unfinished in parts, but full of promise. Samuel stood at the edge of that photo, barely noticeable, holding a set of blueprints rolled under one arm, his expression calm, focused, present. He looked at it for a second longer than necessary, then moved on. Near the elevator, the security guard shifted his stance, unsure whether to say something, unsure whether silence was the safer choice. Samuel gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged presence without asking for anything in return. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing an empty car bathed in cool fluorescent light. Samuel stepped inside, turning slowly as the doors began to close. Just before they met, his gaze lifted once more, not toward the people he was leaving behind, but toward the ceiling, as if listening for something deeper within the structure itself. The door sealed with a quiet thud. As the elevator descended, the building above him continued to function, but not quite the same. Not as smoothly. Not as silently. And somewhere within its hidden layers, something essential had begun to slip out of alignment, unnoticed by those who believed they understood it completely. The elevator descended with a steady mechanical hum, each passing floor marked by a soft chime that felt louder than it should in the enclosed space, and Samuel stood still at its center, the box held close to his chest as the numbers above the door ticked down one by one, 26, 25, 24, a quiet countdown that mirrored something deeper, something the building itself had not yet realized it was losing. Above him, on the operations floor, the first real signs began to surface, not dramatic, not loud, but wrong in a way that made people pause and look twice. A system dashboard froze mid-refresh, the spinning icon lingering longer than expected before snapping back with incomplete data. A supervisor leaned forward, tapping his screen, then calling out softly to the analyst beside him, asking if the network was lagging. The analyst did not answer right away, his brow tightening as he ran the same command again, watching the response time stretch just enough to feel uncomfortable. It was not failure, not yet, but it was not normal either. In the glass office, Richard Collins noticed at this time, a brief delay as he opened a performance report, the file taking 2 seconds instead of 1, just long enough to interrupt his rhythm. He frowned, not concerned, but irritated, and tapped the screen again with a sharper motion, as if the system would respond faster under pressure. Have IT check the latency, he said without looking up, his voice clipped, controlled, already moving on to the next task. He believed in solutions that came from commands, from authority, from structure. He did not believe in things that could not be measured on a chart. Back in the elevator, Samuel's reflection stared back at him from the brushed metal walls, slightly distorted, softened at the edges. His eyes were calm, but there was a weight behind them, not regret, not anger, but something quieter, something that had learned over years to exist without being seen. The box in his hand shifted again as the elevator slowed, the final chime echoing gently before the doors slid open into the lobby. Warm light spilled in from the tall glass windows at the front of the building, late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the polished floor. The lobby was quieter than usual, the distant murmur of voices blending with the faint hum of air conditioning, and for a moment, everything felt almost peaceful, disconnected from the subtle unraveling happening floors above. Samuel stepped out, his shoes making soft, deliberate contact with the floor, each step measured, each movement unhurried. Near the reception desk, a young employee glanced up, her eyes lingering for a second longer than necessary as she noticed the box, the expression on his face, the quiet finality in his posture. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then stopped, unsure of what words would fit a moment like this. Samuel gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement he had given 1,000 times before, and continued toward the exit. Behind him, far above, a second system flickered, then a third, the delays stacking, subtle but spreading, like a thread slowly unraveling from the center of something tightly woven. In the operations room, a warning indicator blinked once on a secondary panel, unnoticed at first, then again, drawing a technician's attention as he leaned closer, confusion settling into his expression. That should not be happening, he murmured under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. But no one yet connected it to the man who had just stepped out of the elevator. The man who now walked toward the front doors with nothing but a box and years of quiet knowledge no one had thought to ask about. Samuel reached the entrance and paused, his hand resting lightly on the metal handle as he looked out through the glass at the street beyond, cars passing, sunlight reflecting off windshields, life continuing without interruption. For a brief second, he stood there, still, listening not to the world outside, but to something deeper behind him, something embedded in the walls, the wires, the systems that had once moved in perfect harmony under his care. Then, without a word, he pushed the door open and stepped into the fading light, leaving the building to discover, piece by piece, exactly what it had lost. Outside, the air carried a faint warmth from the late afternoon sun, the kind that softened the edges of everything it touched, and Samuel stepped onto the concrete walkway with the same steady rhythm he had kept for decades, neither hurried nor hesitant, just present, as if each step had already been measured long before this moment arrived. Behind him, the glass doors eased shut with a quiet seal, separating him from the building that had once felt like a second home, though he never turned back to look at it. A city bus rumbled past at the corner, its brakes sighing as it slowed, while a distant siren echoed somewhere far enough away to feel disconnected from this quiet exit. Samuel adjusted the box slightly in his arms, the cardboard pressing lightly against his forearm, and began walking toward the edge of the property where the sidewalk met the street. Inside, several floors above, the shift that had started as a whisper began to find its voice. A system alert chimed once, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the usual background noise of the operations room. Heads lifted. Screens were checked again. Another alert followed, this one longer, accompanied by a flicker across multiple monitors as data streams hesitated, then staggered forward unevenly. The junior analyst who had noticed the delay earlier sat up straighter, fingers moving faster now across his keyboard, pulling logs, refreshing dashboards, searching for something. That should have been obvious but was not. This does not match the baseline, he said quietly, more to the system than to anyone around him. A supervisor walked over, his expression tightening as he scanned the screen, then glanced toward the glass office where Richard Collins stood, still composed, still controlled, still believing this was a minor disruption that could be solved with a directive. "It is probably a sync issue," Richard said without stepping out, his voice carrying just enough to reassure himself more than anyone else. "Run the standard reset protocol." The supervisor nodded, though something in his posture suggested uncertainty, and relayed the instruction. Commands were entered. Processes were restarted. For a brief moment, the system responded, stabilizing just enough to give the illusion of control. Then, almost immediately, the delays returned, deeper this time, more pronounced, like a structure beginning to shift beneath its own weight. In the server room, hidden behind locked doors and restricted access panels, a row of indicator lights blinked in uneven patterns, no longer synchronized, their rhythm broken in a way that no automated system could fully interpret. The hum of the machines changed, subtly at first, then with a low fluctuation that made one technician pause at the doorway, listening, unsure why it felt different. Back outside, Samuel reached the corner and stopped at the crosswalk, the signal above counting down in bright red numbers, 15, 14, 13. Cars passed in front of him, reflections sliding across the windshield glass like brief flashes of another world, one that moved fast and loud and without pause. He stood still, the box resting comfortably now against his side, as if his body had already adjusted to its presence. For a moment, he closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, not in regret, but in quiet acknowledgement of something complete. When he opened them again, the light had shifted slightly, the sun dipping lower, casting longer shadows that stretched across the pavement. Back inside the building, a new alert sounded, louder this time, impossible to ignore. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A technician stood abruptly, calling out to the others as screens began to populate with warnings that did not follow any known pattern. Richard finally stepped out of his office, his composure thinning just enough to reveal concern as he scanned the room, looking for answers that were not immediately available. "What is happening?" he asked, sharper now, less controlled. No one answered right away. Because no one knew. And across the street, as the signal changed and the light turned green, Samuel stepped forward into the crosswalk, moving with the same calm certainty he had always carried, while behind him, the building he had left just minutes ago began to realize, piece by piece, that the systems it depended on had never been just systems at all. Inside the building, the tension no longer moved quietly beneath the surface, it had risen into the air itself, sharp and visible, carried in the way people stood, the way they spoke, the way their eyes kept darting back to their screens as if expecting them to stabilize on their own. Another alert sounded, louder, longer, followed by a cascade of smaller notifications stacking across multiple monitors like a language no one fully understood. The junior analyst who had first noticed the delay now leaned forward, his posture rigid, fingers hovering above the keyboard as he watched lines of data stall mid-transmission, then fragment into incomplete returns. "We are losing sync across 3 systems," he said, his voice no longer quiet, no longer uncertain. A supervisor stepped in beside him, scanning quickly, then reaching for his headset, calling into another department for confirmation, hoping the issue was isolated, hoping it had a boundary. But the answer that came back carried no comfort. It was spreading. In the server room, the uneven blinking of indicator lights had turned into a pattern of interruption, entire rows shifting out of alignment, then attempting to correct themselves in cycles that never quite completed. The hum of the machines deepened, a low vibration threading through the floor, subtle but constant, like something struggling to hold itself together. One technician moved closer to the racks. Listening, then stepping back again, his expression tightening as he realized the system was not responding to standard inputs the way it should. It was not failing in a way they recognized. It was drifting. Back on the operations floor, Richard Collins stood at the center now, no longer behind glass, his presence sharper, his voice carrying more urgency as he issued instructions one after another, each command precise, structured, confident on the surface. "Run a full diagnostic sweep. I want every system checked, every log reviewed. If there is a fault, we find it now." His words moved quickly through the room, picked up, repeated, acted upon, but the results did not follow. Screens refreshed with incomplete data. Diagnostics returned partial reports, then stalled before completion. One by one, the tools they relied on began to feel less like solutions and more like questions without answers. A senior technician shook his head slightly, almost to himself, as he watched another process fail to execute properly. "It is like the system cannot find its own pathways," he said, the confusion in his voice cutting through the noise. Richard turned toward him, impatience flashing briefly. "That does not make sense," he replied. "Systems do not lose pathways. They are programmed." But even as he said it, another alert triggered, this one tied to a core function, something deeper, something foundational, and for the first time, his certainty hesitated. Outside, across the street, Samuel had reached the opposite sidewalk, the noise of the city wrapping around him in a steady, familiar rhythm, cars passing, people moving, the world continuing without pause or disruption. He walked along the edge of the block, the box still in his hands, though now it seemed lighter, as if the weight it carried had shifted somewhere else. Behind him, unseen, the building's internal systems continued to unravel in quiet layers, each one revealing how much had depended on patterns no one had documented, decisions no one had recorded, knowledge that had never been written down because it had always been there, steady, reliable, understood without explanation. Back inside, the operations floor had lost its earlier calm entirely, voices overlapping now, instructions repeated, questions unanswered. Richard stood still for a brief second, scanning the room, the screens, the people, searching for something solid to hold onto, some indication that control could be regained through effort alone. But what he saw instead was hesitation, uncertainty, and beneath it all, a growing realization that something essential was missing, something no report had accounted for, something no transition plan had included. And though no one said his name, though no one had yet connected the absence to the cause, the space Samuel had left behind was beginning to take shape, not as a memory, but as a gap that the entire system could feel but no one yet knew how to fill. The noise inside the building did not rise all at once but thickened, like air before a storm, pressing down on every conversation, every movement, until even the smallest sound felt amplified. The operations floor no longer carried the rhythm of routine work, it pulsed with urgency, with overlapping voices and sharp glances between screens that refused to behave the way they were designed to. A diagnostic window froze mid-scan, its progress bar stuck just short of completion, and when the technician tried to close it, the command lagged, then failed entirely. "It is not responding," he said, louder now, drawing attention from across the room. Another system alert triggered, then another, each one slightly out of sync, creating a disjointed pattern that made it impossible to isolate a single source. Richard Collins stood at the center of it all, his posture still upright, his expression still controlled, but the space around him no longer responded with the same confidence it had minutes before. He moved from one station to another, scanning screens, asking questions, issuing instructions, yet each answer he received felt incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. "Reboot the secondary network," he ordered, his voice sharper now, cutting through the noise. "If the primary pathways are compromised, we reroute." The command was executed immediately, fingers moving fast across keyboards. Commands entered, systems prompted to shift, to adapt, to recover. For a brief moment, a few screens stabilized, data aligning just enough to suggest progress. Then the alignment slipped again, the reroute failing to hold, as if the system itself did not recognize the path it was being asked to take. A senior engineer leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, his eyes fixed on the cascading logs. "It is not a network issue," he said, his voice steady but low. "It is deeper than that." Richard turned toward him, frustration flickering beneath the surface. "Then what is it?" he asked, expecting a clear answer, a defined problem, something that could be addressed with precision. The engineer hesitated, not because he lacked knowledge, but because what he was seeing did not fit into any standard explanation. "It is like the system lost its reference point," he said finally. "Like it does not know where to begin." The word settled into the room with a weight that no one immediately responded to. Because deep down, everyone understood what that meant, even if they could not say it out loud. Across the building, in departments that had not yet spoken to each other, the same pattern unfolded in different forms. Reports that would not finalize. Processes that stalled at critical steps. Access points that hesitated before responding. Each issue small on its own, but together forming a structure of instability that no quick fix could resolve. In the server room, the uneven hum had grown more pronounced, a low oscillation that seemed to pulse through the racks themselves. A technician reached out, resting his hand lightly against the cool metal surface, feeling the vibration travel through his fingertips, irregular, unsettled. He pulled his hand back slowly, his expression tightening as the realization began to form. Back outside, a few blocks away now, Samuel had found a bench along the sidewalk, shaded by a row of trees whose leaves shifted gently in the late afternoon breeze. He set the box down beside him and lowered himself onto the bench with a quiet ease, his movements unhurried, deliberate. The sounds of the city moved around him in steady layers, distant. Traffic, footsteps, the faint murmur of conversation from people passing by. He rested his hands on his knees, fingers relaxed, and looked out across the street without focusing on anything in particular. For a moment, everything was still. Not empty, not silent, but balanced in a way that required no effort to maintain. Behind him, far beyond his line of sight, the building continued to struggle, its systems searching for something they could not define, something that had once guided their flow without ever being named. And in that quiet distance between where he sat and where the chaos unfolded, the truth began to take shape, slow but undeniable, that what had been removed was never just a role, never just a position, but a presence woven so deeply into the structure that its absence could not be replaced by commands, by protocols, or by anything that had been written down. Back inside the building, the moment of denial had passed, replaced by something heavier, something harder to ignore, and it showed in the way people moved now, quicker, sharper, no longer pretending this was a minor disruption. The operations floor had lost all sense of rhythm, screens flickering with fragmented data, alerts stacking faster than they could be cleared, and conversations breaking into short, urgent bursts that carried no resolution. Richard Collins stood still for a second longer than before, his eyes moving across the room, not scanning for answers anymore, but searching for something he had missed. A senior engineer stepped forward, holding a tablet, his voice steady but firm in a way that cut through the noise. "We ran every diagnostic we have," he said. "There is no external breach. No hardware failure. No software corruption. Everything is technically intact." Richard frowned, confusion now mixing openly with frustration. "Then why is it not working?" he asked, the question sharper, more direct, stripped of its earlier certainty. The engineer hesitated, then turned the tablet slightly so Richard could see the system map displayed across the screen, a complex network of pathways and dependencies that should have been flowing in perfect coordination. Instead, there were gaps, small at first glance, but critical when viewed together. "Because it was never just code," the engineer said quietly. "There are manual overrides, undocumented adjustments, routing decisions that are not in the system logs. Someone has been guiding this infrastructure in real time for years." The words landed with a weight that shifted the entire room. Richard's gaze locked onto the screen, then slowly lifted, his mind retracing the last hour, the conversation, the dismissal, the man who had stood in front of him with a box and a calm voice that he had chosen not to hear. "That is not possible," he said, but the conviction was gone, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain. Across the floor, another technician spoke up, pulling up archived records. "Look at the historical response times," he said, pointing at a trend line that remained stable for years, almost perfectly consistent, until a sharp deviation appeared just minutes ago. "Whatever was stabilizing this system, it is gone." Silence followed, not the calm silence from earlier, but a dense, pressing quiet filled with realization. Richard exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as the pieces aligned in a way he could no longer ignore. The building had not lost a worker. It had lost the one person who understood how everything connected. "Find him," he said suddenly, the command cutting through the silence with a new kind of urgency. "I want Samuel Carter back in this building. Now." The words moved quickly, picked up by multiple voices, repeated across departments, security contacted, front desk alerted, but the responses came back just as fast. "He already left. No record of direction. No vehicle on file." Each answer tightened the space around Richard, narrowing his options, forcing him to confront something he had not accounted for. Outside, several blocks away, Samuel remained seated on the bench, the city continuing its steady movement around him, unaware of the urgency building behind glass walls miles away. A light breeze shifted the leaves above him, casting soft patterns of shadow and sunlight across the pavement, and he sat there quietly, hands resting on his knees, breathing evenly, as if time had slowed just enough to let everything settle. He did not check a watch. He did not reach for a phone. He simply existed in the moment, the same way he always had, steady, present, grounded in something that did not depend on recognition. Back inside the building, Richard stood at the center of the chaos he had helped create, his mind racing through possibilities, through solutions, through anything that could restore control. But for the first time, control was not something he could command. It was something he had already dismissed. And now, as the systems continued to falter and the realization settled deeper into every corner of the room, the truth became unavoidable. The one person they needed was the one person they had chosen to let walk out the door. The shift in the building was no longer subtle, no longer something that could be managed behind closed doors or explained away with technical language. It had become visible in every movement, every face, every second that passed without resolution, and when the elevator doors on the main floor opened again, the silence that followed was different, heavier, as a group of sharply dressed individuals stepped out with a presence that did not need to announce itself. The board members had arrived. Their footsteps echoed across the polished lobby, measured and deliberate, their expressions composed but alert, the kind of calm that came not from ignorance, but from experience. They had seen failure before. They knew the signs. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a steady gaze, stopped just short of the reception desk, scanning the room with quiet intensity before speaking. "We were informed there is a systems disruption," he said, his voice low but carrying authority that reached every corner of the space. The receptionist nodded quickly, her hands tightening slightly on the edge of the desk. "Yes, sir. It started about 20 minutes ago. The operations floor is still trying to contain it." The man exchanged a brief glance with the others, then turned toward the elevators again without hesitation. "Take us up," he said. Inside the building, the tension sharpened further as word spread quickly that the board was on site, moving upward, closer to the center of the issue, and by the time the elevator doors opened onto the operations floor, the room had already shifted into a new level of urgency. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Movement slowed just enough to acknowledge their presence. Richard Collins turned, his posture straightening instinctively, though the control he once carried now felt thinner, stretched by the pressure of everything unfolding around him. "We have the situation under review," he began, stepping forward, his voice measured but tight. "It is a temporary system instability. My team is executing diagnostics and recovery protocols as we speak." The silver-haired board member looked at him for a moment, not interrupting, not reacting immediately, simply listening, and then his gaze shifted past Richard, toward the screens, the technicians, the unresolved alerts still flickering across the room. "Temporary," he repeated quietly, as if testing the word against what he was seeing. Another board member stepped closer to one of the stations, scanning the data, her expression tightening as she followed the cascading failures across multiple systems. "This is not isolated," she said. "This is structural." The room held its breath. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come as quickly as before. For a second, he hesitated, and in that hesitation, everything he had overlooked became visible. The silver-haired man turned back to him, his voice calm but direct. "Who was managing this system before today?" The question cut through the noise more cleanly than any alarm. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his mind replaying the moment, the dismissal, the calm voice he had ignored. "A maintenance worker," he said, the words sounding smaller now than they had earlier. "Samuel Carter." A pause followed, brief but significant, as the board members exchanged glances that carried recognition, not surprise, but something closer to confirmation. "Samuel Carter," the man repeated, slower this time. "You let him go." Richard did not answer immediately, but the silence was answer enough. The board member exhaled softly. Not in frustration, but in realization, then looked back at the screens, at the instability spreading through the system, at the gaps that no automated process could fill. "That was not a maintenance worker," he said finally. "That was the backbone of your entire operation." The word settled over the room with undeniable weight, shifting the narrative in an instant, turning assumption into consequence. Across the city, unaware of the conversation unfolding in his absence, Samuel remained seated on the bench, the fading sunlight stretching longer shadows across the pavement, his presence calm, grounded, unchanged. And inside the building he had just left, the people who had once overlooked him were now beginning to understand exactly who he had been all along. The room did not move for a moment after the words settled, as if the truth itself had pressed pause on everything that followed, and in that stillness, the weight of what had happened became impossible to ignore. Richard Collins stood there, the noise of the failing systems fading into the background of his own thoughts, his earlier certainty now replaced by something far less comfortable, something that did not come with clear instructions or easy solutions. Around him, the board members had already shifted their focus, not to assign blame, not yet, but to understand the scope of what had been lost. The silver-haired man stepped closer to one of the terminals, his eye scanning the fragmented data, then lifting slowly as if measuring the room itself. "Where is he now?" he asked, calm but firm, the kind of question that carried urgency without raising its voice. No one answered immediately. A few glances were exchanged, quiet, uncertain, until someone from security spoke from the edge of the room. "He exited the building about 30 minutes ago. No vehicle logged. Last seen heading east on foot." The board member nodded once, absorbing the information, then turned back to Richard, his gaze steady, unyielding. "Then you are going to find him," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a directive that carried more weight than any order Richard had given that day. For a second, Richard did not move. The room waited. Then something shifted in his posture, subtle but real, as he reached for his phone, no longer issuing commands from a distance, but stepping into something he could not control the same way. "Get me his last known route," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "Check nearby intersections, public transit, anything. We bring him back." The words left his mouth, but they did not carry the same authority they once had. They carried something else. Urgency. And something closer to understanding. Outside, the city had begun to soften as evening approached, the sunlight lowering into a warm glow that stretched across buildings and sidewalks, and Samuel still sat on the bench, the box beside him, untouched since he had set it down. The air moved gently through the trees above, leaves shifting with a quiet rhythm that required no correction, no adjustment, no intervention. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, his gaze steady but unfocused, as if he were listening to something far beyond the noise of passing traffic. For a long moment, he simply breathed, the kind of slow, even breath that came from years of patience, from understanding that not everything needed to be rushed, not everything needed to be fixed immediately. Behind him,